Thank you, Larissa. Welcome, everybody. So today we're in for a treat. Bob Orkand is going to give us a talk on the family name. Was it changed at Ellis Island, or it was changed at Ellis Island, true or false? And let me just give you a little introduction to Bob, although I think most of you probably know him very well. He and Joyce came to Newbridge in October of 21. They came partly to come to Newbridge, but mainly to be close to their grandchildren, as it brought many of us here too. He was for 32 years a rabbi at several congregations in Florida, in Illinois, and then in Westport, Connecticut. And Bob, without taking any more time, I want to hand over to you. And thank you.
I haven't said anything yet. In fact, I just remembered I got to turn off my cell phone here. Okay. So it's good to see so many of you. I'm not going to wear a mask because I find it very, very difficult to speak through it. So I want to begin with two jokes. One of them may not be politically correct today, I don't know, but I'm going to tell it to you anyway. So, walking through San Francisco's Chinatown, a tourist from the Midwest was enjoying all of the artistry of all the Chinese restaurants, the shops, the signs and banners, when he turned a corner and saw a building with the sign, Moishe Plotnick's Laundry. Moishe Plotnick, he wondered. How does that belong in Chinatown? So he walked into the shop and he saw a fairly standard-looking dry cleaner, although he could see that the proprietors were clearly aware of the uniqueness of the store name, because there were baseball hats and T-shirts and coffee mugs emblazoned with the logo Moishe Plotnick's Chinese Laundry. So the tourist selected a coffee cup as a conversation piece to take back to the office. And behind the counter was a smiling old Chinese gentleman who thanked him for his purchase. The tourist asked, "Can you explain how this place got a name like Moishe Plotnick's Laundry?" And the old man said, "Everybody asks me that. It's the name of the owner." Looking around, the tourist asked, "Well, is he here?" "It's me," replied the old man. "Really? You're Chinese. How did you ever get a name like Moishe Plotnick?" "It's simple," said the old man. "Many years ago, I came to this country. I was standing in line at the documentation center of immigration, and the man in front of me was a Jewish man from Poland. The lady at the counter looked at him and said, 'What is your name?' And he said, 'Moishe Plotnick.' Then she looked at me, and I said, and she said, 'What's your name?' 'Sam Ting.' Or I'm sure many of you know the joke about the man who gets to Ellis Island and he goes up to the immigration authorities, and he was a nervous wreck. And the immigration authority says, "What's your name?" And he was so nervous, he says, "Ike Ferguson." And the immigration man wrote down Ike Ferguson. So that's how he got his name. Well, the fact of the matter is, and I hate to break this to you, that neither of those stories could be true. The fact of the matter is, no, your family's name was not changed at Ellis Island or any other port of entry into the United States. And here is how we know. and I want to tell you how I know. And there are two books that I want to recommend to you. The first book is called A Rosenberg by Any Other Name, A History of Jewish Name Changing, by Kirsten Fermaglich, Fermaglich. And the other book that I would recommend to you, for lots of reasons, is the newest book by Dara Horn called People Love Dead Jews. People Love Dead Jews. And I'm going to use both of those books as my source today for what I'm going to tell you. So, how do we know that your name or family's name was not changed at Ellis Island? First of all, there was no language problem at Ellis Island. The immigration authorities were not rent-a-cops. They were highly trained people who were required to be fluent in at least 3 languages. And there were additional translators to ensure competency. And the languages spoken by Jewish immigrants were far from obscure. Even Yiddish was not an obscure language. Second, immigration processing at Ellis Island was not like going to the airport today. You know, you stand in line and you show your ID and they let you through. The interviews at Ellis Island took about 20 minutes or more, because the purpose of the process was to weed out anyone who was likely to become, in the jargon of the day, a public charge. Right? So you had to prove that you had support in the United States. So this is not a case where some idiot behind a desk was just trying to move the line along. And if he didn't understand the name, he would just assign a name to someone. It didn't happen that way. And the other thing is, or another thing is, no one at Ellis Island ever wrote down the name of immigrants. Immigrants' names were already provided by ship manifests compiled at the port of origin. And ship manifests in Europe were based on passports and other state-issued documents. And those compiling the manifest had to be very, very careful, because an error, that is, if someone was not able to get on the ship, would cost the shipping company money. And so the authorities at the other side in Europe were very, very careful to record the names as accurately as they could. And so the immigration authority at Ellis Island or elsewhere would simply be checking off names on a manifest. So there was no assigning of names. The immigrant was not asked his or her name other than to show a document with the name already on it. But how many of you think or know that your family's names were changed in the United States? A lot. Okay? Well, the fact of the matter is, there was name changing. Thousands of court records from the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s of Jewish immigrants and their children filed petitions in New York City civil court in order to change their own family names. Okay? That's the point. They changed their own family names. And the only way that they could do that was by going to court. So someone went to court, and they had to provide the court with their reasons for changing their names. And that's where we see the heartbreaking reality behind the funny stories about name changing at Ellis Island. Because as Fermaglich points out, in these legal petitions, we meet thousands of American Jews, most of them born in the United States. That is, these are the children of the immigrants, explaining under oath that they were changing their names because they couldn't find a job, or because their children were being humiliated or discriminated against at school, or because their real names were complicated and were hard to say, and they were afraid that no one would hire them. Because essentially, and this is the important point here, American anti-Semitism, they thought, would prevent the success of their families. So Vermeglich analyzed thousands of name changes. And she said that there were very clear patterns. One of those was that the majority of those who wanted to change their names felt that their names were simply too complicated. So in 1932, for example, which was about 10 years after Ellis Island was closed, over 65% of name changes in New York were filed by people with Jewish-sounding names. Okay? The closest to that number, which is actually not close at all, were Italians. Okay? And they only made up 11% of those who wanted to change their names. Okay? So the Jewish population was larger than the Italian population then, but not 6 times higher. So how do you explain the large number of people who wanted to change their names? The sad thing is that what was being witnessed was the really debasing act of succumbing to discrimination instead of fighting it. Okay? In those days, Jews did not feel that they could fight anti-Semitism, so they had to go through the rather debasing process of changing family names, which obviously had existed for a very long time. Anti-Semitism in those days was, as Vermeglich calls it, private and therefore insidious. In the earlier part of the 20th century, years before all of this happened, anti-Semitism in this country was very public. That is, you would see advertisements in newspapers that said, Christians only. Or you would see signs on hotels and restaurants that said, no Jews or dogs allowed. Okay? And in fact, Vermeglich tells a story of a man who was hired to play. He was a pianist, and he was hired to play at a resort. And he gets to the resort, and it says, no dogs or Jews allowed. And he wondered how he, Alan Wolfson, could manage to pass. And he soon found himself playing a grand piano beside a marquee the hotel had provided, announcing tonight's performer, Alain de Wolf. Okay? Now what began to happen is by mid-century, the beginning of the 20th century, mid-century, these rather explicit markers had morphed into something else. And that is that anti-Semitism became much more subtle and a rather open secret. And so you began to find a change in the language of these posters, these signs. So you could find things like, Sabbath observers need not apply. Or another sign that would say, churches nearby. Okay? So people would apply for jobs, and the employers would demand information not only about the applicant's birthplace and citizenship, but also equally mandatory and entirely irrelevant, asked about the parents' and grandparents' birthplaces, the parents' professions, the mother's maiden name, the grandparents' surnames, etc., etc. And so the employers, knowing that Jews were changing their names, began to ask questions to find out if the person sitting in front of him or her was in fact Jewish. So anti-Semitism in the United States always, thank God, was unofficial, right? There was no official American anti-Semitism. There was no government-sponsored anti-Semitism, unlike the places from which these immigrants had come. But because anti-Semitism was unofficial, Jews found that in order to resist discrimination, the only way they could do that was to go through the bureaucratic process of having their names changed, in the hope that they could reshape their personal identity, rather than resorting to the kind of civil rights activism that might compel us today to resist anti-Semitism. Okay? So what all of this points to, and the real story here, was how oppressive the situation must have been in which these Jews found themselves. So even those who chose to participate in organized Jewish life felt that the only way that they could succeed, the only way that they could get ahead, was by, in a sense, through their name change, denying who they were. So if you look through the information that Vermeglich and others have published, you find heartbreaking stories about how these people participated in the very humiliating situation in which they found themselves and the humiliating things that they had to do to escape the reality of life in mid-century America. Well, what's interesting is, and this is what was fascinating to me, is that when people petition the court to have their names changed, there is no evidence that Vermeglich and others could find that applicants used anti-Semitism as the reason. Instead, the petitioners almost uniformly refer to how their names were foreign-sounding or difficult to spell or pronounce, even when the name was actually spelled phonetically. Okay, so you had one petitioner who said, I want to change my name. My name is Greenberg, because Greenberg is not conducive to good employment. Or Rose Lefkowitz declared her last name difficult to pronounce, as if there are a lot of ways of pronouncing Lefkowitz, right? Another person said that, and his name was Louis Goldstein, who declared his name to be un-American, an economic handicap. Now, unfortunately, he stood before the wrong judge, because the judge's name was Louis Goldstein. So the petition was denied, okay? Or Max Heimowitz, Hymowitz, described how his son Emmanuel found their name cumbersome, an annoyance, and the father felt that changing the name would promote his son's, quote, comfort and interests, socially, educationally, economically, and patriotically. I want my son to have an American-sounding name. Okay? So what was interesting is that many names circulating in the United States during this period were foreign-sounding and difficult to pronounce and spell. For example, let me give you some examples. LaGuardia, Roosevelt, Juilliard, Lindbergh, DiMaggio, Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, and Eisenhower. Okay? Yet, as the remarkably low number of non-Jewish name change petitioners in New York City demonstrate, such families and their forebears do not appear to have been, quote, subject to embarrassment or affected socially, educationally, economically, and patriotically. Okay? So what was all of this about? Okay? Why the stories that all of us have heard, or some of us may even have thought before you walked in the room today, why this myth about Jewish name changes at Ellis Island? Well, the fact of the matter is that Ellis Island, the Ellis Island legend, is simply the final step in this multi-generational process of denying, hiding, and burying the reality that American Jews feared the most, namely the possibility that they were not welcome here. The Jews that came through Ellis Island and other ports of entry, one of their greatest fears was, based on their experiences in Europe, that they would not be welcome here either. So now we know the myth and the reality. And we can ask some more interesting questions. Why did so many American Jews tell this story about their names being changed at Ellis Island? What purpose did it serve? And why do many skeptical or educated, skeptical people still want to believe it now? And I want to suggest to you that every diaspora Jewish community in world history had at least one founding legend, a story about its origins that members of that community accepted as fact, no matter how ridiculous that story might have been. So let me give you an example. You have the founding of the Jewish community in Poland, the story about the founding Jewish community in Poland. The story goes that when the Jews arrived in Poland 1,000 years ago, the head of the Jewish community announced in Hebrew, Polin, which in Hebrew means, here we dwell. And that name spread to the local people and stuck. Okay? And in case that didn't make Poland Jewish enough, the Jews coming to Poland, afraid of persecution in that new land, hid during the day in caves in the Polish forests, studying Talmud. They then sneaked out at night to carve the names of the tractates of the Talmud that they were studying onto the trees. And the local Polish people noticed this and began revering these places as holy. And later, Jews who arrived in Poland discovered just how welcome they and their traditions were in this bountiful new land, because the names of all of the tractates of the Talmud were already carved into the trees of the Polish forest, simply waiting for them. Okay? That is an example of a founding myth of a Jewish community. And this is only one of many ridiculous stories in fashion in the generations following the Jewish migration to Poland centuries ago. And those myths, especially the Polish myth about the founding of the community, was repeated by popular 19th century Polish writers, Jewish writers, I.L. Peretz, Agnon, and other authors of Polish origin took these stories and incorporated into the works that they wrote. Okay? It's a perfect example, a silly example, but at the same time a very serious example of a founding myth of a Jewish community. Or another example is that the Jews in France claim that the Jews had lived there since the time of the first temple in Jerusalem nearly 3,000 years ago. That's not true. But it was a great alibi for explaining to their Christian neighbors why they weren't involved in killing Jesus. We were lived here before Jesus. We've always been here. Jewish communities in other places use these founding myths as a way of saying to the local people, we belong here. We were here before you were. So you need to accept us. You need to accept us because we've always been here. Okay? So there's a clear pattern here. And that is what Jews had to do, or felt they had to do, when you were utterly vulnerable but could not admit it. And these founding myths express the Jewish community's two highest hopes and deepest fears. The first hope is that the Jews in this new place will remain part of the chain of Jewish tradition. And the second hope is that the local population will accept them. Okay? So, in ways that made sense to each community, these founding myths created a fantasy of total acceptance in a non-Jewish setting and of total continuity with Jewish tradition. Okay? So, the new Americans and their children living in what they hoped was the first place in centuries where their families could enjoy full and free lives, soon discovered that when they applied for a job as Rosenberg, nobody would hire them. But when they applied as Rose, everyone would. Imagine, if you will, the private humiliation of changing your name, of accepting the unspoken yet deniable fact that this intergenerational marker of who you are is publicly considered revolting. Imagine the betrayal, right? At enormous risk and expense. You or your parents had fled other places to spare yourself and your children this very same humiliation or worse. But now you suffer the slow, seeping, soul-shaking discovery that this new place is, in important and life-limiting ways, no different. That this golden Medina, with its streets paved in gold, was, at least you thought, even less accepting than the places from which you came. So you accept this new reality, and you lie in court about your motivations for succumbing to this new reality. Or even worse, you come to believe your own lies, because the reality is simply too painful to acknowledge. How can I say to my children, we're not wanted here? How can I say to my children, we made a mistake? There's anti-Semitism here as well. And so what you do as sort of self-defense, you create stories about how these name changes took place. And in a sense, what this new Jewish community was doing was creating its own founding myth about how we came to come to this country and how we changed our names and became immediately accepted into American society. Now imagine telling your children years later about what you did. Telling them the truth wouldn't only implicate you, it would also implicate America. Right? In other words, how do you say to your children, we gave up a part of our identity in order to live here, to bring you to this wonderful land, but you know, it really wasn't that wonderful because there was anti-Semitism here. How do you say that to your children? You would be telling your children that you thought you would be accepted here, but in fact you were fooled. Because this place is just like every place else, only in a sense more insidious. Because the discrimination isn't written into the law, so you can't even publicly protest it. All you can do is submit to it, publicly agree with it, announce in court of your own free will that I want to change my name because my name is un-American. And that the very essence of who you are is unacceptable. Right? There is nothing that reflects our essence more than our name. If you tell your children, if you tell that story to your children, you'd be confirming two enormous fears. First, that this country doesn't really accept you. And second, that the best way to survive and thrive is to dump any outward sign of your Jewish identity and symbolically cut that cord that goes all the way back to Mount Sinai, which in the case of names like Levi and Cohen actually does go all the way back to Sinai. Now imagine that instead of telling your children these psychologically damaging things, you have another option. You can do what Jews have done for thousands of years and create an origin story that turns those fears into hopes. You can tell your children, you know, something funny happened at Ellis Island. Something completely innocent that didn't hurt you, but in fact helped you. Look what happened at Ellis Island, you could say. The immigration authority changed your name from some complicated Jewish name to some simple sounding name because he wasn't smart enough to be able to pronounce the name. Right? If you tell that story, you've made America into a place where people maintain their Jewish identity without any interruption of the line from Sinai. And second, you made America into a place so welcoming that happy non-Jews greet you at the door and then make mistakes that coincidentally help you fit right in, at no cost to you or to the 3,000-year-old tradition you want to maintain. You understand the point? If you can tell your children that, then the name change was simply an innocent mistake made by an ignorant immigration authority. But we're still Jewish. And not only that, the immigration authority sort of did us a favor because he gave us a name that's a little easier to pronounce. That is the legend that the ancestors of today's American Jews created for their descendants. We were told that our ancestors were definitely not humiliated people facing the reality of American anti-Semitism, even though that is demonstrated by thousands of court records. No, our ancestors, we can say, were brave and hopeful, people who were joyously welcomed by Americans, welcomed through that golden door. Now, the lethal attacks on American Jews in recent years and in recent days have been so shocking and so disorienting, not merely because of their violent horror, but because they contradict the story American Jews have told themselves for generations, which is that America has never been a place where anti-Semitism ever affected anyone's life. We simply don't prefer this founding legend. The fact of the matter is, though, we need it. The story is more important than the history, because the story is the device that makes meaning. Now, it might be upsetting to learn that the Ellis Island story is only, in quotes, a legend. But in a way, I find that story sort of empowering, because it reveals the enormous emotional resources available to our ancestors and to us. Our ancestors, those that came before us, could have dwelled on the sordid facts and passed down that psychological damage. We weren't accepted. This is not the great place we thought it would be. But instead, they created a story that ennobled us and made us confident in our role in this great country, which means that we have creative power too. Our ancestors, those that came before us, were creative enough to create a myth that allowed us to fit in. And the result of that has been the enormous success of the American Jewish community. There has never been a Jewish community like this one in all of Jewish history. This is the only place where Jews, despite the anti-Semitism that certainly exists, it's the only place since the destruction of the temple in 70 of the Common Era where Jews can live in freedom. Again, despite the anti-Semitism. We are free to be who we are, and more importantly, we are free to honor the names that we have. I don't know how many of you saw on cable The Old Man. Did any of you see that movie? Well, in that movie, there's a very powerful conversation about the value of a name. There's a beautiful moment when one character says that a name is just a breath. And essentially that name is so easily changed to another. A changed name is not a lie. It's survival. And another character who obsesses over his own good name and saving the good name of another says, "You're right." And I couldn't help but think about the changing of Jewish names in America and the changing of names in Israel. Almost every new Oleh, person moving to Israel, at least this used to be the case, the less so today, changed his or her name to something that reflected power, personal power, something that reflected hope, rather than the lack of hope that they had experienced in Europe. And again, they had the power to assert themselves through their names. I want to close, before I take questions or comments, with a poem written by Zelda, who was born in 1914 in Ukraine and died in 1984 in Jerusalem. And I'm sure many of you have seen this poem. It says this: each of us has a name given by God and given by our parents. Each of us has a name given by our stature and our smile and given by what we wear. Each of us has a name given by the mountains and given by our walls. Each of us has a name given by the stars and given by our neighbors. Each of us has a name given by our sins and given by our longing. Each of us has a name given by our enemies and given by our love. Each of us has a name given by our celebrations and given by our work. Each of us has a name given by the seasons and given by our blindness. Each of us has a name given by the sea and given by our death. Thank you. So, questions, comments? Nancy's going to come around.
Can I start?
No, yes, go ahead.
So,
Since you have a microphone in your hand, of course.
So that was a wonderful talk, and it was wonderful how you made everything into a positive, actually, even though some of what you said was disturbing. But I wanted to just say that Prue and I came from the United Kingdom. And the thing that struck us when we arrived here was what we probably hadn't quite realized the depth of, and that was the anti-Semitism in England. And that Britain has as the head of state the Queen, who is the head of the Church of England.
Mm-hmm.
And the separation of church and state is a really fundamental importance.
Speak up a little bit.
Oh, sorry. The separation of church and state is clearly extremely important, particularly to the Jewish people. And I just wanted to make that comment.
Thank you. Okay, other comments? Why don't you hand it to your lovely wife?
Well, acknowledging everything that you say, and it's really so powerful, I would like to also expand it out a little bit to say that the real villain here was the culture of the melting pot, where the whole directive was for everybody, no matter which denomination, which nationality, give up your language, give up your songs, give up your ways, give up your name, and quickly join the melting pot. And that's how you became an American. And so Italians and Asians had quotas. I mean, it hit every group of people.
Yeah.
And I thank you so much for your message, which was very interesting. But I think the whole idea of the melting pot was pervasive.
That's a very good point. I agree with you. Yep. Okay.
Is this on? Yep. What do you think would have happened if, when a judge said, "Why are you changing your name?" the person said, "Because my name sounds very Jewish, and there's discrimination in this country.
Okay. So I don't know what would have happened, but my sense is that saying that would have meant buying into the idea that there was anti-Semitism at all. In other words, if you go to court and you say, my name is hard to pronounce, right? You could be anybody with a name that's hard to pronounce. You're not admitting to anything other than, I can't get a job because of my complicated name, whatever. But as soon as I admit to the fact that I'm changing my name because it's anti-Semitism, I'm giving in to the anti-Semitism rather than fighting it. Now, these people who changed their names thought that they were fighting the anti-Semitism by finding a way around it. Okay, I think for most of us, we would think in a very different way. Okay? But in those days, since anti-Semitism, as I said earlier, was private and rather insidious, to acknowledge the anti-Semitism would have pitted this person against the judge who had said, no, there's no anti-Semitism here, or what's wrong with you, this is a golden land, right? So by simply saying my name is too hard to pronounce, I can avoid the topic altogether. But I wasn't there, so I can't attest to that. Yeah.
So in the very beginning, you indicated that the statistics you were relying on were from the 30s and 40s and what have you.
At 20s, 30s, and 40s. Yeah.
What about what came before that, the immigrants that came in the late 1880s and the very early 1900s?
So the Jews who came earlier didn't change their names that we know of. They may have at some point, historically, but they didn't change their names. In those days, anti-Semitism was much more out in the open, and there was a greater sense that we as a community need to fight it. But as soon as it became private and not seemingly official, there needed to be a different tactic. Yep. Yep, go ahead.
This goes back a little further, but I think it deals with what you just described, in that my great-grandfather came from Germany in 1863. Mm-hmm. And one interesting thing was that the ship manifest from Hamburg was written obviously in German, mm-hmm. but there is a corresponding manifest that was written at Castle Island that is written by an English-speaking person, and the name was the same. And the name was changed on his naturalization card, mm-hmm. This was probably about 1865. Mm-hmm. And as you just indicated, it just made it simpler, because the name originally was Königsberger, and it was changed to Königsberg.
Right. Which is still complicated, but not as complicated.
Not that bad.
Thank you.
I have a quick story.
I don't see who's got...
Roz.
Oh, Roz, okay. I'm sorry. I couldn't see.
This is my family, and I hate to say it, but it's true. When I met my husband, his name was Pfefferholz, and his father had two brothers. One had a big automobile shop, and his father was in the chicken business. The guy in the automobile shop said, "We have to change your name because I'm not getting any business." His father, people would come in and said, when they heard his name, they didn't want to do any business with them. So out of the three brothers, two changed their name from Pfefferholz to Holt. One brother said, "I'm a Jew, I'm never going to change my name," and he never did.
Okay. Good story. Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Surnames for Jews.
Take it away from your mouth just a little bit. That's it.
Okay. Surnames for Jews used to be son of, like a patronymic.
Ben or Bat.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
Simon Ben David.
Right.
At some point in Europe, governments decreed they had to have a family name, particularly in German provinces. And they often gave them names that were not very
Right.
attractive.
Right.
But wealthy people could
Choose
buy
it.
names like
Yeah.
Rosenberg, which was
Right.
considered a.
So remember, originally, last names were descriptive.
Yeah.
You know, it could describe the street on which you lived, or your occupation, or you know, the house color next door. I mean, something like that, because you know, with just first names, you run out of names. So how can you tell the difference? You're right.
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 But then these names were not ordained by God, except for names like Cohen or
Right.
Levy.
Right.
But so in every country where Jews have immigrated, they have tried to change their names to fit in, including Israel.
Right.
And,
Israel a
is
little
that
bit different,
more
yeah.
noble than...
Right. Israel a little bit different. I think Israel, and this is less so true today than it was during the times of the founding of the state. The people wanted to adopt names that reflected new beginnings, the sort of the dream as to what Israel should be. You know, like Ehud Barak, you know, the former defense minister of Israel and prime minister. You know, Barak means lightning. You know, I don't know what his original name was, but he changed it to a name that sounded powerful. You know, that's who we're going to be in this new country. Yeah. Right. All right. I don't see who has the second mic. Oh. Okay.
Stephanie, so in addition to what you said about changing names in the courts, the other way of changing a name was when you were naturalized. Any citizen who was naturalized was given the opportunity to change without paying any money.
Right.
And all they did was indicate in their naturalization what name they came under and what name they were
Right.
going to be,
Right.
and they signed it both ways. The other comment I wanted to make is names were changed not just because to hide the Jewishness. We have a relative whose name was Kiva Nachmanovich. He changed it to Charlie Goldstein. He lived with a family, the legend is, he lived with a family named Goldstein, but also Goldstein was a nice American Jewish name, not like Nachmanovich.
Right. It wasn't as obvious.
Which was Eastern.
Yeah. Good point. I don't see. Go ahead.
I don't think that the immigrants were necessarily going to a court to get permission. I mean, they changed their names, and
They could only change their names through some governmental authority, right? So either the courts or the naturalization process, right? It's not that they didn't change it, they couldn't change it simply on their own. It had to be done officially, right? But again, the point is, a government official did not change someone's name unless the person requested the change.
yeah, and I think people changed their names without going to governmental sources. Now, my family there was 3 brothers, and 2 brothers wound up in Rhode Island and 1 in Massachusetts. And their name originally was German, I guess, Ehrenfrucht, fruit of the evening or whatever. it is.
Right.
And one of the families in Rhode Island still said Ehrenfrucht.
Mm-hmm.
There was another family in Rhode Island that just said Frucht. And my grandfather said fruit. Well, actually, he said fruit. And that was changed by me to fruit. But I don't know anybody dealt with courts or anything like that.
They had to have. Now, look, people, I'll tell you a story. I told this to somebody today that my mother's name was Ruth. So we went on a trip to Mexico with my mom and my dad, And I'm standing, in back of my mom, who was short. So I'm looking over her shoulder, and she hands her passport to the immigration authority in Mexico, and it says Rebecca. And I said, "What did you do with my mom? I mean, who are you?" She said, "Well, I decided I didn't like Ruth. Rebecca, I like Ruth better." And that was, early on. Okay, so every time she signed a document, a legal document, apparently, she would sign it Rebecca. But if she was writing a letter or whatever, she would sign it Ruth. Now, people do that and have done that, more with first names than with last names. Yep.
I have read, and I might don't remember correctly, but I thought that particularly I think it was in Poland or Germany, where they assigned your original name was Chaim ben Joseph, all right?
Right.
And that's how names were used until one of the governments officially decided you had to have a. Am I correct in that assumption?
I think you are, but I don't know. Faye, you probably know better than I. In fact, I know you know better than I.
Both in Russia and Poland and many other nations, they decided people had to have last names, partly so they could keep track of them and tax them and whatever. So they had to choose a permanent name. In some of the places, people were allowed to choose their own permanent names. But in others, they were assigned, and you will find in places in Poland, all the people in one village have Polish-sounding names, even if they're Jewish, and another one they'll have German because it was part of Austria-Hungary, et cetera. So some names were assigned.
And I know that some of those names, this is a sort of an anti-Semitism in itself, were assigned Christian names. And you couldn't change it because it was a government decree that was your name. Yeah.
Anybody else that I might have missed? Questions?
If not,
No? All right.
oh, Nancy's getting her exercise here.
Fiorello LaGuardia was a translator at Ellis Island.
Was a translator?
He was a translator for years. He spoke 9 languages.
Yep. Thank you. All right, everybody, thank you very much.
Thank you.